There's a moment I remember clearly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was disturbingly ordinary. A child talking back. Nothing new, nothing unusual. Just a small voice pushing against an instruction that had been given with full confidence and zero negotiation rights. And yet, in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not in the child, but in the adult watching the scene unfold. Because what I realized, standing there in the middle of that everyday argument, was that I wasn't only dealing with a child, I was also dealing with my own childhood. Funny how that works. You think you're correcting behavior, setting boundaries, doing the right thing, and then suddenly you hear a voice in your head that doesn't belong to the present moment. It belongs to the past. A past where children didn't ask questions, they just complied. And here's where it gets complicated. The child in front of you is not living in that past. They are living in now. So, when we talk about parenting, real parenting, not the textbook version, we're really talking about a silent negotiation between two childhoods, the one we survived and the one we're raising. And most of us don't even realize which one is doing the talking. The problem starts to show itself in the quietest ways. Not in the loud arguments, not in the dramatic teenage rebellion scenes people expect, but in the small, almost automatic reactions. A child rolls their eyes. You feel something tighten in your chest before you even think. A child delays doing something you asked. Your tone sharpens faster than your logic can catch up. A child asks, why? And suddenly it feels less like curiosity and more like disrespect. But what's actually happening in those moments is far more psychological than behavioral. What gets triggered isn't just the present situation, it's memory, emotional memory, the kind that doesn't sit neatly in words but lives in reactions. I once watched a boy hesitate before completing a simple task. His parent didn't yell immediately. No, it started with silence, that dangerous kind of silence that carries history in it. Then came the shift in posture, the tightening of control in the voice, and finally, the sentence that revealed everything. Don't start this behavior with me. But the child wasn't starting anything new. He was just existing in a way that reminded the parent of something old. That's what psychologists sometimes refer to as emotional flashback responses in parenting. Not a clinical diagnosis in this context, but a pattern. When present day behavior unconsciously unlocks past emotional experiences. Suddenly, the child is no longer just a child. They become a stand in for the younger version of the parent, who once had no voice, no choice, or no room for explanation. And this is where things quietly begin to fracture in communication. Because the parent believes they are responding to attitude, laziness, or disrespect, while in reality, they are responding to emotional echoes. Echoes of how they were spoken to. Echoes of how authority once felt sharp instead of guiding. Echoes of being corrected without being understood. The child, on the other hand, doesn't see any of that history. They only see the reaction in front of them. Sudden intensity that doesn't match the situation. So they adapt the only way they know how. Either they withdraw emotionally, becoming quiet and guarded, or they push back harder, escalating what started as a simple interaction. And just like that, a cycle begins to form. Not because anyone is bad at parenting, but because the brain is efficient. It reuses familiar emotional pathways, especially under stress. What was once survival becomes default behavior. But what makes this stage particularly important is that it is invisible to both sides in real time. Nobody is saying, I am reacting from my childhood right now. They are simply reacting, and the child is simply absorbing. This is where most misunderstandings in parenting begin. Not in lack of love, but in unexamined emotional inheritance. What makes this pattern so persistent is that it is not random. It is learned, rehearsed, and quietly reinforced over years. Psychology has a way of explaining it that sounds almost too simple for something so emotionally complicated. We repeat what we know. Not necessarily what we like, not what we were told to do, but what our nervous system recognizes as familiar. So, a parent who grew up under strict correction may unconsciously lean into strictness, even if they once swore they would never parent that way. Another parent who experienced harsh discipline may swing completely in the opposite direction and become overly permissive, confusing love with the absence of boundaries. Both are responses to the same internal blueprint, just expressed differently. There is a well known behavioral concept behind this: repetition compulsion. It describes how people unconsciously recreate familiar emotional environments, even painful ones, because familiarity feels safer to the brain than uncertainty. In parenting, this becomes especially powerful because the stakes are emotional, daily, and immediate. I once observed a situation where a mother insisted her child must learn discipline early, a phrase she repeated almost like a shield. The child had forgotten a school item, something minor in the larger picture of life, but the response was disproportionate, not in volume, but in intensity. It wasn't just about the missing item, it was about responsibility, consequences, and an unspoken fear of what lack of discipline could lead to. When we unpack reactions like that, we often find something deeper than parenting philosophy. We find history. Many adults carry a silent belief, formed in childhood: if I was corrected harshly and I turned out fine, then it must be necessary. This belief is powerful because it is reinforced by survival bias. The fact that they survived their upbringing becomes mistaken for proof that the method was correct, rather than simply endured. But children do not interpret discipline through the lens of survival. They interpret it through safety, trust, and emotional predictability. What feels like toughening them up to a parent can feel like unpredictability or emotional distance to a child. And here is where the cycle quietly strengthens itself. A child raised under rigid emotional conditions often learns one of two responses. They either internalize it and become overly cautious, perfection driven, and afraid of mistakes, or they externalize it later in life by rejecting structure entirely, associating discipline with control rather than guidance. Then, when they become parents, they do not start from a blank slate. They start from that reaction. So the cycle does not just repeat, it evolves. What makes it even more complex is that intentions rarely match outcomes. Most parents are not trying to recreate their own upbringing consciously. In fact, many are actively trying to avoid it. But intention alone does not override deeply ingrained behavioral programming, especially when stress enters the room. And parenting is full of stress moments: time pressure, fatigue, repeated instructions, emotional fatigue from daily responsibilities. In those moments, the brain does not reach for philosophy, it reaches for familiarity. That is why change in parenting patterns is less about knowledge and more about interruption. The interruption of automatic response, the interruption of inherited emotional reflexes. Because without that interruption, the past continues to quietly write parts of the present, one reaction at a time. Modern children are not necessarily more difficult than previous generations. They are simply operating in a completely different psychological environment. That difference is where most of the friction in households begins. There was a time when childhood was structurally simpler: fewer external voices, less public comparison, and authority figures were more centralized: home, school, community. A child's world was smaller, and within that smaller world, rules were clearer, even if they were stricter. Today, a child's world is constantly expanded and interrupted. A single phone places them in contact with opinions, trends, peer feedback loops, and emotional stimulation that earlier generations never had to process at that age. That changes how they think, how they question, and how they emotionally regulate. So when a parent says, "In my time, children didn't behave like this," what they are often missing is context. It is not that children have changed in their essence, it is that the input into their emotional and cognitive systems has multiplied. I once saw a simple home scenario unfold around something as ordinary as a phone restriction. A child was asked to put it away and focus on a task. The response wasn't immediate obedience or immediate rebellion. It was negotiation, questions, reasoning, delays. The parent interpreted it as resistance. The child interpreted it as fairness. Two completely different frameworks colliding in real time. And this is where communication gaps widen. Older parenting models often prioritize compliance. Do it because I said so. That structure assumes authority alone is enough to regulate behavior. But modern adolescent psychology shows something different. As children grow, their brains develop stronger needs for autonomy, explanation, and participation in decision making. This is not rebellion by default, it is cognitive development. The challenge is that when autonomy is not acknowledged, it often reappears as defiance. There is also another layer that rarely gets discussed: emotional exposure. Today's children are not only dealing with school and home expectations, they are also processing constant social comparison. Even subtle things, like seeing curated lifestyles online, can influence self esteem, patience, and attention span. It does not always show up as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as irritability, withdrawal, or apparent lack of focus. So, when a parent reacts with frustration, believing the child is simply being careless or disrespectful, they may be responding to a surface behavior while missing the underlying pressure that behavior is coming from. But here is where the real tension lies. While children are adapting to a more complex world, many parenting strategies still operate on older emotional assumptions. That mismatch creates misunderstanding on both sides. The parent feels the child is not listening. The child feels the parent is not understanding. And in that gap, everyday interactions become battlegrounds for interpretation rather than cooperation. What makes this even more subtle is that modern children are more emotionally expressive than previous generations. They ask more questions. They articulate feelings earlier. They challenge inconsistencies more openly. In some households, this is misread as disrespect, when in reality, it is often emotional articulation without refined social filtering. So the real issue is not that children today lack discipline or respect. It is that the language of discipline and respect has changed, while many households are still speaking the older version of it. And until that mismatch is acknowledged, both sides will continue to feel like they are speaking clearly, while being misunderstood in real time. In the end, what this all comes down to is not a battle between old parenting and new parenting, but a quiet awareness that many of us were never taught how to separate our past from our present. Because every time we react too quickly, too sharply, or too emotionally, there is often a second conversation happening underneath the surface, one between who we were as children and who we are trying to be as parents. The real shift begins when a parent learns to pause long enough to ask a simple but uncomfortable question. Is this response about what my child is doing right now, or what I once lived through? That single moment of reflection can change the entire direction of an interaction, not because it makes parenting easier, but because it makes it more conscious. Children do not need perfect parents. They need present ones, people who can see them clearly without constantly filtering them through old memories, old rules, or old wounds. And when that happens, something important changes in the home dynamic. Discipline stops feeling like control and starts feeling like guidance. The irony is that most parents are not trying to repeat the past. They are trying to improve it. But improvement cannot happen automatically. It requires awareness, adjustment, and sometimes uncomfortable honesty with oneself. And for the child, that difference is everything. It determines whether they grow up feeling corrected or understood, managed or guided, controlled or supported. So the balance is not about choosing between your childhood and your child's. It is about recognizing when your childhood is quietly speaking and deciding consciously whether it should be the one in charge of the moment. If this resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments. I do read them, and I often respond where I can. Like, share, and subscribe. And let's keep building conversations that make parenting a little more conscious and a little less automatic.